All right, team, it is that time of the week. Once again, welcome to another episode of the Exceptional Leadership Podcast, episode 11. And as always, I'm your host, Matt Hamilton, and delighted to have your company once again. Let's get started. In 1945, after the death of Henry Ford, the legendary founder of the Ford Motor Company, the company was left in a state of uncertainty. The world was changing rapidly, and the company that had once revolutionized the auto industry now faced new challenges. Into this tumultuous environment stepped Henry Ford II, the grandson of the company's founder. At just 32 years old, Ford II had no previous experience leading a major corporation, and he was immediately met with skepticism. To many employees, the idea of a young, untested leader taking the reins of such an iconic company was unthinkable. Henry Ford had been a larger-than-life character, a visionary who had fundamentally changed manufacturing and reshaped the American economy. In contrast, Ford II was seen by some as an outsider, a young man without that same deep-rooted connection to the company's legacy. So his first task was a daunting one. He faced a company that was struggling in the post-war era with outdated management structures and a workforce that was loyal to the previous leadership. There were rumours of resistance among employees who felt that their beloved founder's absence left a hole that could never be filled. The new CEO was under intense pressure to prove himself. But he was no stranger to hard work, and he was determined to carve out his own legacy. He didn't shy away from making the tough decisions either. He brought in outside talent to refresh the leadership team, often making moves that were controversial within the company. He restructured operations, streamlined production processes, and redefined Ford's brand and vision. Over time, his efforts began to bear fruit. He didn't just preserve the company's legacy, he modernized it. Under his leadership, Ford would introduce game-changing models like the Ford Mustang, which would go on to become a symbol of American automotive culture. The company not only survived the post-war challenges, but thrived in an increasingly competitive industry. So by the time Henry Ford II stepped down in the 1970s, the company had transformed. He won over the employees who had once doubted him, proving that his vision, decisiveness, and leadership were exactly what the company needed. Though he'd come into a difficult situation with the shadow of his legendary grandfather looming large, Ford II's legacy would be defined by his ability to forge a new path for one of the world's most iconic companies. And for those of you who have ever stepped into leading a brand new team, that story will resonate very strongly with you, I suspect. You will probably remember well the feeling of suspicion, this sense of suspicion with which you were held by your team members who you were about to lead. And it is quite palpable at times. I think it's especially challenging when you're taking over the leadership role from someone who has become, for all intents and purposes, a part of the furniture. You know, maybe they've been there for decades or just several, years, and they've become this really much loved member of the organization. And people often don't hide their disappointment and sadness, that this person has vacated and you're here in their place. You might hear little comments in the months after you take on the position along the lines of, such and such used to do such a good job, or we wish that, the old leader was here, whatever it might be. Those little comments probably don't do wonders for your confidence, I wouldn't think. But it is, to be honest, just a part and parcel of the situation, okay? If you're a new leader, regardless of your experience level, you can be someone leading a team for the very first time or someone who's actually a very experienced leader coming in to lead a new team. It really doesn't matter. You're the new person. You're going to be held with suspicion. And as I said, if you're replacing someone who is much loved, you're probably going to have to deal with these little sort of comments where people aren't hiding their disappointment that you're not who that person was. So that's just something that you're going to have to deal with. It's all part of the fun and the games. But what are some techniques that we can employ to perhaps make this transition a little bit smoother for all involved? I've written down 3 things that I'd like to go through. And, the first is understanding that as a new leader, we have to understand that building trust takes time. You can never expect, as I said, regardless of your competency level, you can't expect to just waltz into the leadership of a new team and everybody loves you, everybody trusts you, everybody thinks you're super confident and competent, and you get their loyalty right from the get-go. It just doesn't work like that, unfortunately, okay? You're going to have to earn their loyalty, trust, and respect, okay? That's why having those things is so cool. Because they are hard to earn. It takes time to earn those things from people, which is the way it should be. But that's something that's going to take time, okay? So we need to go in prepared and understanding that that's just the way it works. We also need to make sure we ask questions. The last thing that we want to do is walk into a new leadership role with a new team and come across as if we're a bit arrogant and we know everything. Because the reality is that, as I said, regardless of your competency level, you just don't, right? If you've never worked in an organization before, it would be foolish to assume that you know everything there is to know. So it really does pay dividends to ask people, okay? Even if they're really junior members of your team, they might have information that is really applicable to the job that you're trying to do. So, practice a little bit of humility, put the ego to one side, regardless of your competency level, and perhaps ask questions. How do you know what should change if you don't ask questions? But more importantly, how do you know why things should change if you don't ask those questions from the people who have more experience in that organization than you do? Really does make sense logically, doesn't it? All right. Ask questions. The other thing that asking questions does is it signals to, your new team members that you're leading for the first time. It signals to them that you are humble enough to admit that you don't know everything there is to know, and that is a big deal. All right. It signals that you're willing to learn. It signals that you value them. It says, "Hey, I'm looking to be collaborative and consult you guys." It says, "I value your knowledge and your input." And that is a great way to lay the foundation upon which you can start to build that trust, loyalty, and respect. So don't underestimate the power of asking questions. Secondly, and this is really related to point 1, I've written down don't impose. What I mean by that is don't come in with that arrogant attitude, with that know-it-all attitude, beating your chest. That is a really quick way to put people offside quickly. All right. You don't want to be one of those people who comes across as trying too hard, right? When you say respect my authority, people instantly don't. That's just the way it works, okay? You've got to earn those things. So don't come in there, trying to impose yourself. Treat people with respect, be humble, sideline the ego a little bit, and just try and learn and figure out who's who. All right, and that brings us on to the third point, which is the observing of personalities. All right, so, you'll eventually want to do things like assign tasks to the person who is best placed to do it from a skill set perspective and maybe a stress tolerance perspective as well. Some people might be capable of more than others. You also might like to delve a little bit deeper into the specific skill sets that your team members have because you might want to sort of promote them in a specific channel or go down that track. Just know them a little bit better. It's very hard to do that if you don't sit back and observe the personalities first. Of course, delegation is important and you'll have to do that from the get-go to some extent, but perhaps before you give people, really big new sort of projects, for example, and you really sort of try and implement major change that the organization or the team hasn't seen before, maybe before you try and kick those initiatives off, let's ask the questions. Let's learn about what needs to change and why. But also, before we implement those changes and begin that process, let's make sure we've observed the personality so that you know who's best placed to either take on that task or so that you know who you should involve with you in the executing of that task. Very, very hard to do that if you haven't taken the time to scope out a person's skill set, stress tolerance, so on and so forth. Okay. The other thing, and this is just a little bit of a side note, I won't get into this too much, but a lot of us, when we're building really good relationships with people and we start to feel comfortable at work, you might sort of let the walls down a little bit and start cracking jokes and things like that. If you haven't taken the time to observe and learn personalities in your team, you might say something that could cause offense. Maybe you jump to a conclusion, which was that this person has the same sense of humor as I do, and you say something that's a little bit edgy, and all of a sudden they're offside, and you've got a bit of an issue there because you've misjudged how comfortable they are with you. All right, so I would suggest, before you get too comfortable, before you start cracking those jokes, which might be a little bit borderline, just make sure that they're comfortable with it first, okay? Just make sure that they share a similar sense of humour and that they sort of see things the way that you do. I think that's a really good tip to make sure you've got some harmony in the workplace and don't cause offence. All right, but that takes time. Okay, so the other thing, guys, is just the general environment, okay? And then we'll move on to politics, but let's start off with the general environment. It's not just people within your team that you need to sit back, observe and get to know. It's also part of the wider organisation as well, right? You need to understand who's who in the zoo, so to speak, in the wider organisation. You will find that there are some people in the organisation who it's just really good to know. There are people who hold the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, and often those people aren't really senior people. Sometimes people have a lot more influence than the seniority of their role would suggest. And I'm thinking about, let's play with a really basic scenario. So you've got a CEO or a managing director or even just a senior executive manager, and you would really like to get a piece of comms or an email across their desk because it's something that you need to solve quickly and you need their input on. Well, if you send off an email, they get a lot of emails. Maybe they won't see it, in a time span that is appropriate for the situation. So it helps to know, for example, an executive assistant really well, who has that influence and has the ability to get things across the desk and in front of the eyes of a senior person like that a little bit more quickly than you would be able to without their input. So that's an example of someone who holds that power above and beyond what their sort of seniority level within the organisation would suggest. So learn who those people are. They're often really, really good people to have healthy working relationships with. And then politics, all right? Look, most of us absolutely hate politics, but unfortunately, they exist in every single organisation you care to mention. It doesn't have to be a corporate sort of work, corporate sort of organisation. It's sporting clubs, it's schools, it's all sorts of things, right? It's friend groups. Politics are unfortunately unavoidable. I always laugh when people say I don't play politics. It's like, well, you don't really have a choice. you can not sort of actively get involved in politics, but you at least have to have some education around politics to understand what's going on and understand what should and shouldn't be discussed in certain settings and things like that. So I always laugh when people say they don't play politics. They are everywhere. They are unavoidable, unfortunately. So please take the time to sit back, understand the politics of the place, understand, the context behind things and stories and whatnot, really just to ensure that you avoid committing any social faux pas, all right? We want to make sure that we operate intelligently and that we don't cause undue offence or, maybe damage our relationship with someone simply because we've misread a situation and aren't aware of the politics behind the topic. It is really important to be across those things. The other thing I'll touch on, guys, just circling back to the start here, when I said, coming on board as a new leader and winning trust and winning respect and winning loyalty, the other thing to understand is how other people perceive you. I remember a situation where, and this has happened a couple of times, but, I've wanted to just have a friendly chat with someone in my team, for example. And I've gone up to them in an impromptu fashion. I've not sent an email or anything like that requesting a meeting. I've tapped them on the shoulder and said, hey, just jump into this meeting with meeting room with me real quick. I just want to have a chat with you about something. And I thought nothing of it. But that person has had a freak out, I've learned later on, because they've assumed that I'm calling them in to give them a dressing down and tell them off. And I had absolutely no intention. It was just a normal conversation about something work-related. So that's a good example of just a little reminder about understanding how other people perceive you, all right? You are the boss, you are in a position of authority, and with that comes the perception, okay, that other people have of you. And it's important to understand how they perceive, all right? And to adjust and tailor your behavior accordingly, because you don't want to cause distress to anybody when it's not warranted, all right? So that's just a little anecdote. Bear in mind how other people perceive you. And in closing, for that reason, that's why I'm touching on these aspects, all right? Make sure that you're very cognizant of how you're perceived when you come into an organization, all right? You're not just a new face, you're the boss, you have a position of authority over these people. That means they are going to be super tuned in to you and your behavior and the vibes that you're putting off. So just make sure that you're aware of that and that you adjust your behavior accordingly. And given enough time, and the understanding that winning respect, trust, and loyalty takes time, you will eventually get there. All right, guys, I hope that helps. Something else that we should touch on as well, if you haven't listened to episode 10, jump back and have a listen, because in episode 10, we discussed something called situational leadership, which is also highly applicable to this scenario where you're learning to observe personalities and tailoring your response to those personalities depending on what you see. Situational leadership, just as a headline sort of summary, is essentially the theory that not every single person responds to the same approach or technique. Depending on their competency, depending on their emotional makeup, you're going to have to use different leadership tools to get the best out of them, and that varies from person to person. So remember your situational leadership framework. On the Instagram page, there is a picture. I put up a post with the situational leadership framework, which might be really helpful. But jump back, listen to episode 10 if you haven't downloaded that information and got across that, okay? It's very important. All right, guys, we will leave it there. Before we do close it out, check out the show notes. There's a link there. It says send us a text. If you are inclined to do so, you can literally ask me any question you want. Maybe I'll bring it up on the show if it is suitable with respect to our programming and whatnot, and we can perhaps go through it on the show and answer your question. I'll give you a shout out. That would be really cool to have some interaction with you guys along those lines. Or just tell me about a time when you've had a challenging experience. I'd be really interested to hear from you about what concerns you with respect to leadership. What are the challenges that you have on your plate? Of course, guys, subscribe to the show, whatever platform you listen to the show on. Jump on our LinkedIn page, our group page. It's a really good opportunity for you guys to connect with people and network and just get some sort of tips and tricks with respect to leadership in that professional setting. The link to that is in the show notes as well. And of course, finally, guys, jump on to the Instagram page and give us a follow for content that you won't see in the podcast, right? So things like videos and reels and things like that. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to speaking with you next time. See you later.